Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our rescheduled webinar on working productively with an editor. I'm glad those of you who got here today did. And for those of you who have no idea what happened and you're here for the first time, welcome. And everything worked wonderfully. This was originally scheduled for earlier in this week. We had some technical difficulties and had to reschedule. So hopefully this will work out even better because it gives us a little bit more time to talk about editing and working with an editor. So before I turn it over to our speaker, just a little bit about her. This is Sarah Gray, who's an editor as well as an indexer at Ideas on Fire. She also runs her own editing company called Gray Editing, where she edits for ESL students, novelists, professors, judges, activists, you name it. She spent a long time working as a translation project manager before that, and a lot of her approach to editing and working with authors comes out of that work in the translation world. And so I think she's going to talk a little bit today about how those two industries, those two processes interact with one another. In 2016, she was awarded the very prestigious ACES Editing Society's Robinson Prize for Excellence in Copy Editing. She regularly writes and teaches for copyediting.com and has presented at numerous editing conferences, including ACES, the Editors Association of Canada, as well as the Editorial Freelancers Association. She's also a freelance writer. You might be familiar with some of her food writing or her project Friday Night Meatballs. So I'm very excited for Sarah to be here today to talk to you about working productively with an editor. Oh, I'm Kathy Hannebeck, sorry. Forgot that. I'm Kathy Hannebeck, I'm president of Ideas on Fire, and I'm very excited for you to be here for our webinar. Okay, I'm going to turn this over and get our presentation set up, and this should be fine, and Sarah can take it from there.
Okay. All right, thank you so much, Kathy, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'm really excited to talk with you about this topic. I think figuring out how to work productively with an editor before you get started is one of the smartest things you can do, so congratulations on being here today. I've been a full-time freelance editor for about 6 years now, and as a writer, I also am edited myself on a regular basis. So I like to think that I've learned a little something about the care and feeding of authors. And I know how I like to be treated and what it's like kind of from the other side of the page. So I don't know how many of you have been edited by a professional before. You might have chosen the person yourself, you might have paid them yourself, or through a publisher to do all of that. Maybe you were nervous about it. Maybe you weren't thrilled about the end results. Maybe you were. A lot of people kind of come into this process feeling like the editor is an adversary, someone whose job it is to really tear your work apart. Or, you know, maybe you feel like you're back in high school English class being ripped apart by a red pen. There are also some of us who enjoy being edited, who feel that we learn from it and really grow as writers during the process. But it's normal to have some fears and concerns going in. It's not always an easy process, but done correctly, it can be a smooth one and a productive one, and really a very creative and exciting project. And in the end, ultimately, you get an end product that's better than you could have imagined. I had a client once describe it as coming into a hotel room that you had left messy and finding that the housekeeper had made the bed and folded the clothes and freshened the towels and put a mint on the pillow. And that's really how I want my clients to feel when I'm done with their text. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about why you might work with an editor and how you might feel about that. And then I will give you an editor's perspective on the process and some tips to help you make this relationship one that supports your work and helps you open up new markets for your writing. Now, the decision to work with an editor may or may not be up to you. In the old days, and this is still true for some trade publishers and small publishers, your publisher would assign an editor to you. They might even have had one in-house. That's generally not the case anymore, particularly in academia. This is 2017, academia being what it is. Most academic publishers push this responsibility onto authors entirely. So you may find yourself responsible for finding an editor, paying that editor, and basically doing everything up to turning in camera-ready copy. Your publisher might keep a list of freelancers who they recommend, but you become responsible for everything else. So there are very good reasons to hire an editor, but you might be tempted to cut corners. You might feel like you're pretty good at this whole grammar thing. You don't really need to worry about it. You might want to do it all yourself. You might have a friend or family member who is pretty good at this stuff and ask them to help you out. So you have to make a decision about whether or not to work with a professional. Now, this probably isn't going to shock you, but I am going to recommend that you work with a professional editor. And there are a few reasons why. First of all, as you see here, you are not the best judge of your own work, really. And I'm a writer too. I know that that's not always an easy thing to swallow, but it really is true. The editor, Michael Pryor, blogged about this pretty recently, and I thought he said it pretty well. As the writer, you cannot be the reader. The very things that made you the writer, the knowledge of everything that went into the book and everything that didn't, means that you cannot be the fresh, wide-eyed reader who has simply picked this book up because of the wonderfulness of your previous work, or because the cover had a picture of a cat on it. If you strain really hard, you can perhaps be aware of a potential reader's expectations or even their experience in reading your work, but you really can't put yourself in their shoes. It takes someone else to do that, and that's the editor's job. We're really a proxy for the reader. Even going beyond that, I think once you've stared at your own manuscript for 2 or 4 or 6 years, however long it's taken you, you start to get numb. You start to have difficulty seeing certain things. And you're so deeply and intimately familiar with your subject matter that it's impossible to know what could be unclear to someone who's new to the subject. What is it that reads like jargon? What needs more explanation? You need someone who is an educated reader, but not necessarily familiar with exactly what you're talking about. Hasn't seen your research before. Next, and this has to be said, editors are trained and experienced professionals. Your mom is not an editor. I mean, unless she is an editor, in which case you're golden, go for it. But for most of us, we are not related to professional editors, and the people we ask who are friends and family who are good with words are going to miss things because they're not trained. They're not skilled, they're not experienced in this profession. They're not going to know what to look for. Their reactions as readers to the story and the information are very good information for you to have. That's very valuable. But think of them as big readers. You can't count on them to catch inconsistent tenses, authorial intrusion on the narrator's voice if it's a book that has a narrator. They're not going to catch the formatting errors in your APA citations. That's just not what they're trained to do. That's why editing is a profession that requires training, just like electricians or surgeons or plumbers. You wouldn't want an unpaid, inexpert friend replacing your plumbing. And I think it's really important to extend the exact same care to the book that you've poured so much of your life and your heart and your soul into. Third, you're going to be judged by the quality of your work. That gets noticed in readers and book reviews. And that's something that helps sell your work as well. We're not agents, but when you're trying to sell a manuscript, nobody wants a book that's full of typos and factual errors and self-indulgent tangents. Nobody wants a book that doesn't speak to its audience. And peer reviewers pay attention to this, journal reviewers pay attention to it, and it comes up in word of mouth. To me, honestly, there's nothing sadder than when really excellent work fails to reach a broader audience just because it didn't get the editing that it needed and deserved. If your book has really brilliant ideas and impeccable research, but the name of a recent US president is misspelled on the first page, which is a real thing that happened recently, you just won't be taken as seriously. So I'm going to read you an excerpt from a review of that book that spelled Barack Obama wrong on the first page. Because I think this is the risk that you take when you don't hire an editor. The first thing to say is that any rebuke to the author is complicated by the difficulty of understanding her writing in the first place. The book is surprisingly replete with typos, grammatical non sequiturs, and conspicuous absences of basic contextual information. This combines with an erratically zigzagging argument to produce moments of almost total incoherence. The whole thing cries out for a merciless edit and a full-scale rewrite, and it's hard to shake the suspicion that the book's release was unduly expedited to capitalize commercially on the aftermath of Trump's election. So those are all good reasons to hire an editor, and there are many more. But I hope by now that you're on board and ready to get your book polished, and that that's why you're here. So I'd like to jump into talking about how to hire an editor if that's a decision that's been left to you. First of all, you want to make sure that you're hiring a professional. Don't go straight for the lowest price. There are websites that will give you the lowest price, guru.com, elance.com, and so on. They'll promise you rock bottom prices, and you will get exactly what you pay for. The pay is in fact so low on those sites that most of the time editors that you get aren't necessarily native speakers of the language they're editing. They're not trained. They're generally not going to be very high quality. So instead, what you're looking for is experience and credentials. There's no certifying body for editors in the US. Canada does have one. The Editors Association of Canada does certifications. But there are several professional associations that most professional editors join. They provide professional development, networking, and a lot of other benefits. So the top two in the US are the Editorial Freelancers Association, which is the EFA.org, and ACES, the Society for Editors. And you can see the websites here. Both of these have registries where you can search for editors, look at resumes, and find someone who specializes in what you need them to specialize in. The EFA also has a job listing service where you can create a classified ad that will help you find what you need. It'll be emailed to members, and this is particularly good if you have a very specific need for subject matter expertise. If you've already found us at Ideas on Fire and Gray Editing, you are probably already in the right place. We are very good editors, but the question is, are we the right editors for you and for your project? So that's what you've got to figure out now. So once you've found some candidates, look at their resumes, look at their websites. Is their website well edited? Check out their projects, check out their testimonials. What you want to find out is whether this person is experienced and also whether their experience jives with the project that you want to send them. Some editors are academics, some will have a PhD, some will not, certainly not all. I personally do not have a PhD. Many are generalists by temperament. I count myself among those, but we develop specialties as we go along, particularly in fiction versus nonfiction, and then subspecialties. For example, I specialize in copy editing in the humanities. I work on lots of political and cultural theory, philosophy, media studies, history, foreign policy. I can and will work on lots of other things, but that's really my bread and butter. And you'll notice that that's not a specialty in the academic sense. In academia, if I had stayed there, my specialty would be something like representations of queer women in interbellum European literature. And that might very well be what you want, particularly if you're looking for developmental editing. And I'll get into the differences between kinds of editing in a moment. But that might be something that you're interested in for a developmental editor. You want someone who is also a scholar. And IOF does offer editors who have PhDs. They know the scholarly fields, they know the debates, they know the texts that you're citing, and they can advise you on how you're engaging with your sources, how marketable your work is in the context of the current scholarship, and things like that. In a copy editor, you're going to want something a little bit different. And that's someone who's familiar with the languages and the conventions of your field. But also has an idea of what the educated lay reader is going to feel as they come across your work. They can tell you whether what you're saying is intelligible to someone who doesn't share your specialty. Now, I'm only a generalist up to a point. If your book is a field guide for bird watchers or a text on theoretical physics, I'm probably not a good match for you, and I'm not going to take your project. I'll tell you that, and I'll try to find someone for you who is. If your book has lots and lots of mathematical equations, you will want a copy editor who's specialized enough to parse those and know the notation to be able to typeset them properly. But you want to find someone whose general interests line up with yours, who's going to know the terminology and the way that your readers think. So again, you want an editor who can stand in as a proxy for your reader and be an advocate for your reader, because that is an editor who can help you reach those readers and move them and make them your fans. So it's important to take that into account. I want to talk about the editing process itself. First of all, it's important to be clear about what you want. Editors can do a lot of different things, everything from completely reworking your book to a very straightforward proofread. And the clearer the picture you have in your mind of what you want, the more likely you are to get what you want. Let's go through a couple of different types of editing. I mentioned developmental editing. This deals with structure, the big picture, the content itself. This takes place after you've written the first draft and before the manuscript is finalized. Developmental editors help you take your raw material and organize it to flow in the way that a book should. Is the book unfocused? Does it need to hew more tightly to your thesis? Is it engaging with all of the relevant arguments? Does it answer those arguments thoroughly enough? Are your arguments logical? Are there sections that should be added or deleted or moved around? How do you want to set up each chapter? Are you missing a conclusion? Those are the kinds of questions developmental editors deal with. At this stage, you should anticipate your editor making lots of major changes and also asking you to make major changes or to write new material yourself. There's going to be some work still to do at that point. A manuscript critique, on the other hand, can happen at various points in the writing process, before or after developmental editing. It's a little similar to developmental editing, but there's less emphasis here on structure and more on content. This is particularly common for fiction, but it is also extremely useful for nonfiction. In this process, the reviewer is giving you comments and evaluations. It's feedback rather than making changes themselves. That's still your job. So maybe that ponderous middle chapter is really slowing down the pace of the book. Maybe the narrative goes on a side trip that isn't really necessary. So this will give you some ideas for rewriting, and you may need to do some substantial work after a manuscript critique. Copy editing, on the other hand, happens once that content is in its final form. This is also known as line editing. And I want to emphasize, by the way, that if you aren't sure what kind of editing you need, it's best to come to someone like us for an evaluation. Because if you do need developmental editing or a manuscript critique, you don't want to hire a copy editor yet. You don't want to copy edit something that is still going to be rewritten or that may not end up in the book at all. Copy editors don't make major substantive changes to your book, but we will suggest them if we think there's a really serious problem. Copy editing is more at the paragraph and sentence and word level. We're going to analyze the text very, very closely for logic, consistency, flow, style, word choice, tone, grammar, spelling. This is where the language itself, as opposed to the ideas, really get whipped into shape and polished and perfected. Finally, there's proofreading, which is really the last step in the editing process. And this generally happens after your book has been laid out. So you'll have what are called galley proofs, which are sort of final pictures of the page as it will become, usually in PDF. And the proofreader goes through that at the word level, searching for typographical errors, layout errors, grammar and spelling mistakes, numbered lists with 2 4s in them, headers that are missing from the top of the page. If you spelled Kyrgyzstan wrong, that's the sort of thing your proofreader is trained to catch. There are other editorial services that may be of use sometimes. Localization and adaptation, for example, are great for manuscripts that are being written in one country and published in another. And if anyone has questions about those, we can certainly talk about them later. But if you know which of these services your manuscript needs, you'll be in a better position to hire the right person and to have your expectations fulfilled. And if you're not sure what you need, that's okay too. Come and talk to us. I also believe very strongly in knowing who your readers are. One of the most important things that an editor can do for you is helping you make sure that your writing is speaking to the audience that you want to reach. I hope by the time you have a finished manuscript that's ready to begin the editing process, that you have at least some idea of who's going to be reading it. Now, this is more straightforward for some genres than it is for others. You're writing a history of US intervention in North Africa that's both for scholars and political activists. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Maybe you're writing an introductory linguistics textbook that's aimed at undergraduates. Maybe you're adapting a chapter of your dissertation on the use of rhyme in Shakespeare's tragedies into an article for a feminist literature journal. Those are all fairly clear-cut audiences, and that makes them much easier to describe in, say, a book proposal. Your editor can be on the lookout for ways to make your book more appealing or more accessible to that target audience, as well as spotting and correcting ways that you might unwittingly alienate potential readers. Once you get started with the editing process, and I can't stress this enough, talk to your editor. Be open with them. Tell them what you want. This is sort of like telling the truth to your doctor. It's really important to understand what the issues are so that we can give you the treatment that you really need. If you ran into obstacles while writing, if there was something that was a block for you, let us know about it. We can help. There will be goals also that will be specific to your project. So what are your goals? Do you have goals or expectations that we might not guess right off the bat? What about the publisher? What are their goals? You want to make sure everyone is clear about the scope of the editing and what all of you want out of it. A lot of books also have very specific quirks. If you're writing a science fiction novel, you may have invented a whole new race of beings with a very original naming system. Maybe you're an American, but you're writing about South Africa and you want to keep the South African spellings of certain terms, even though you're using US English as a whole. Maybe you're used to writing for specialists and now you're writing something that's more for a general audience and you want your language to be accessible. Maybe you've made up new terms or new words to capture your concepts about, say, how the brain processes art. And you want to make sure your editor doesn't get confused when she doesn't find those words in the dictionary. So those are all things that we need to know about. If you have reference materials that are particularly handy, for example, if you are working with a subject matter that uses a lot of Arabic or Russian names, and you have a certain kind of transliteration that you're using to spell those names, that's a great thing for us to know. If there's a glossary of specialized terms or a specific dictionary you want to use, pass those on. You are really the authority on your topic. So teach us how to help you, and we will do a much better job helping you teach your readers. Also, on project scope, it's really important to define exactly what you want your editor to do. And a good professional editor will help you figure this out and really spell it out in detail so that both of you know exactly what's being done and when you can expect it done. And it's best to spell that out up front in writing. What do you want the editor to do? What don't you want the editor to do? What's the schedule? What do you do if something messes with the schedule? Are you paying by the hour? Are you paying by the word or the page or a flat project rate? If it's flat rate, how will you account for anything that falls outside of the original scope that you've defined? Are you paying part of the cost up front? What's your overall budget? Now, your editor should take the lead in spelling all of this out, but it's good to know that you have an expectation about what you'll be paying and that you are prepared to to stick with the schedule and the budget. However, I do want to mention that the scope of a project can change. And sometimes that's a bad thing, and sometimes it's an important and a necessary thing. So I'm going to give you an example from my own editing practice. I edited a novel a few years ago. I was working with the author on another project, a scholarly nonfiction project, and he liked my work and said, look, I've got this novel. I really need some help with it. I'd love for you to take a look at it. It's just a straightforward copy editing job, just, you know, grammar, spelling, punctuation, that sort of thing. Maybe keep an eye on tone. And this was my first time editing a novel. And I told him that, and he said, that's okay, I don't mind. Let's try it out and see how it goes. So we had planned for maybe 10 hours of work. Once I got started, it became clear that the manuscript actually needed a lot more work than we'd originally realized. We had American characters speaking British English. We had continuity errors, things that I couldn't have caught in an initial evaluation of a single chapter. There was a timeline where we would jump back and forth between childhood and adulthood, and I realized about halfway through that the math simply wasn't adding up. Characters were the wrong age, pregnancies were too long or too short, and so on. So I went back to the author and I told him about it, and we agreed to expand the scope of the project. We ended up making timelines for the characters, collaborating closely on reworking things. And at the end of it, the novel was far better, and I had a loyal client. That was a big change in scope, and we had to rework our project agreement in order to accommodate it. But I was charging him by the hour, and so that worked out okay. I kept him apprised of the cost as we went along. But if we had agreed on a flat rate ahead of time, and I'd based it on 10 hours, that might not have worked so well. So it's really important to define your scope at the outset and then keep revisiting it anytime something changes. I also want to note the importance of following your editor's instructions. If you're working with an academic or a trade publisher, it's really important to note that once you're in the publisher's world, you are on their schedule. They're working with editors, graphic designers, printers, and marketing people, and that's all based on your schedule and your deadlines. So something coming in late can really throw a wrench into the whole works. If you're asked to review changes or make an adjustment by a specific date, please try to respect that schedule. And if you don't think it'll work, tell them right away. It's just important to be conscious that you're part of a larger whole. You will get instructions when you get your edited manuscript back as well. When I send a client a marked up file, I generally include instructions on how to review and implement or reject edits, how to make comments. They're usually pretty straightforward. We work in Word, so it would be track changes or comments. But if you ignore them and do it a different way, it might take me hours and hours to go back and redo things and put them the way that they need to be in order to send it to the typesetter. And again, that's something that can wreak havoc on the schedule and the budget. We spend hours and hours a day working on these kinds of files, dealing with the finer points of Microsoft Word. And we also know publishing conventions. So by all means, ask questions, figure out why you're being asked to do something, but you may also want to extend some trust on the finer points of the mechanics. One example is that I will often ask editors not to make any changes to their files while they're in my hands. I will ask you to step back, let me do my work, and then come back into the process once I send you those files, tracking all of your changes so that I can track what you've done. I might also ask you to name your files in a certain way. And this is about what we call version control, which is making sure that everybody is working on the right files at the right time and that things aren't being done in two different places that will then have to be put together. So these are about best practices to help keep errors from sneaking into the text. Let's talk about the edits themselves. Carol Fisher-Saller, who is at the Chicago Manual of Style. She writes the monthly editing Q&A on their website, which I highly recommend checking out. It's a lot of fun. she's a great thinker on this topic, and she's got a book called The Subversive Copy Editor, which has a whole section about writers and editors working together. She likes to tell writers to think of editing as a gift, not an insult. It's so easy to think of editing as an insult. You get your manuscript back, right? And it's covered in red ink. Maybe literally, maybe virtually, track changes everywhere. Your commas have been moved. Your semicolons are gone. Maybe whole sections have been cut or switched around. And you get this long email that comes with it. Here's what I thought was great. Here's what didn't work. Here's what I want you to think about. Here are some consistent issues with your writing and some things that need to change. On your book. That's your baby. This is yourself, right? You've poured yourself, your soul and your heart, and you've sweated over it until it was perfect. And now this person is telling you that it's not perfect. And they want to mess with it. And they want you to pay them to do that. It's a little hard to swallow, right? It's almost like being back in school and, you know, having someone correct your grammar in front of everyone. But no book is perfect. No book is perfect. The best writers in the world are the best edited writers in the world. And the greatest, most successful writers you will ever meet get those same emails and those same manuscripts that are dripping in red ink. Every single one of them. And the really successful ones learn to roll with that. They learn to value it and embrace it. So take a deep breath, make a cup of tea. Remember that your editor is not your mean old English teacher. We're here to help. We're on your side. And if you can get through this process, your book will be so much better for it. So I want to tell you a little bit about what's going on in my mind when I'm sitting down with your book. This is a bit of a manifesto here. Here are my goals. To publish a book. To publish a book that will sell, to get your manuscript ready for layout, to bring your manuscript in line with house style, to make sure that your voice shines through clearly without being impeded by mistakes or interruptions in the flow of your language, to make sure that the book is internally consistent, to make sure that it's free of errors, to make sure that you come across as the expert in whatever it is that you're writing about, to make you look good. Now you'll notice what's not on this list. To humiliate the author, to get my way on everything, to ruin your book. Now, there are jerks in every profession. I will be the first to admit that, but I can tell you that most editors are in this because we really love good books. We love to read, we love writers, and we want to spend our days immersed in good books. We also tend to have a perfectionist streak. We like to put things right. We're here for you, and we're on your side. And we do all of this privately and confidentially so that no one ever needs to know what your first draft looked like. They just know how beautiful it comes out at the end. So what I'm telling you is try not to give in to red ink panic. If you feel it starting to hit, just give yourself a day or two and set it aside. Take some deep breaths and come back. I think it's important to know that not all of the changes that are being made are mistakes in the way that you might be tempted to think about mistakes. Some are simply about making sure that you're conforming to the publisher's style guide, like the Chicago Manual or the AP Style book. Some might just be about making things consistent. And I want to recommend, by the way, if you don't already have them, get yourself a copy of the manual that will be used on your book, whether that's Chicago, APA, AP, or something else. And really just get to know it. They're full of wisdom. They will make you a better writer. The 17th edition of the Chicago Manual just came out, so this is a really good time to pick one up. I like to think of it as going to a makeup artist when you're going to be on TV. If you're going to be on television, you will be given makeup, whether you look like Tyra Banks or Richard Nixon. Your makeup artist isn't there to make you feel ugly. Right? He or she is there to get you ready for prime time. They know how the spotlights are angled. They know what color the light is when it hits your face. They know what the camera will do to the way you look. And their job is to highlight what the camera picks up so that you show your best face to the world. And that is what your editor is doing on your book. We want you to get that edited work back, take a deep breath, and say, this is so much better. I often recommend that clients actually turn off track changes and look at the finished product without any of that red ink, just to read through it and see how it reads without thinking about what's been changed or deleted, and see how it feels. I've had clients tell me they can't live without it anymore. They don't know if they can send anything out into the world without being edited first. And that's how we want you to feel. We're on your team and we're your most passionate advocate. So we're here for you. And we just need you to be here for us. So that might mean things like responding to changes in queries. We're going to have questions for you. Sometimes we'll call out something that's a maybe. You know, did you mean to say this? Maybe this would be more appropriate. Just don't leave us hanging. Say yes or no, explain what you're thinking, answer our questions. You may find edits that you disagree with as well. You have the right to ask why your editor changed something. We might have a good reason. There might be a factual error or a house style. But if you still disagree, you can always say no. Anything that's changed can be changed back. It is your book. Your editor is not going to go to the wall on a change unless they are really convinced that this is crucial to the quality of the book or the credibility of the book. And if that's the case, you should probably at least consider what they're saying. It's just important to keep an open mind. It's difficult, I think, to let someone at your finished draft when you spent years perfecting your craft and working on it. But your editor can tell you when those changes need to happen, and you might really benefit from doing so. William Faulkner very famously called this killing your darlings. There might be a beautiful turn of phrase that you are just so proud of coming up with, and it's great writing, but it's just not moving the book forward. And so maybe it has to be taken out, and maybe you can use it somewhere else. But it's important to be willing to part with things that don't make your book better. I think it's also worth saying that your editor owes you some courtesies too. You always, always, always have the right to have any edit explained and justified. You have the right to clear and honest communication about your work. You have the right to quality work. You might find some errors on your editor's part. No edit is ever going to be 100% perfect, but you can and should speak up if you're finding more than a few stray flukes. And above all, I think that you have the right to have your authorial voice respected. I think this is actually so key to what editors do that I've made it the motto of my business, bringing your voice to life. I think your voice is at the heart of what we do. You put so much thought and craft and art into developing the voice of your writing. It might be your voice, it might be a narrator's or a character's voice, it might be the voice of a historical figure, but always you have a voice and we are being drawn into your world. We hear you in our mind's ear as we read. Your editor's job is to get to know your voice, to know it intimately. When we step away from the computer after spending hours with your manuscript, it should stay with us. It's such a powerful thing to be immersed in a writer's voice. And once we've come to know it, we can evaluate your writing to spot and correct any places where that voice is being disrupted. A strange tone or an uncharacteristic formality, anything that changes what we're meant to be hearing. Something just doesn't make sense, doesn't work. We develop a sense for that kind of thing. And if we spot it, we'll tell you and fix it. So that what your readers hear is simply what you want to give them. Nothing more and nothing less. I hope I've convinced you that the editing process is not only worthwhile, but crucial to putting out the absolute best book that you can produce. Behind every great author, there's a great editor behind the curtain, making sure that everything's perfect. You are dedicated to your craft, and you deserve the best possible editorial support to help you succeed. The editing process can be arduous. It requires a lot of work on both sides and a lot of trust and a willingness to loosen your grip. It can be humbling. And a good editor will walk you through it. And once you get comfortable with being edited, I think you'll wonder, as many of our clients have, how you ever lived without it. Thank you so much for being here, and I think we have some time for questions.
Hi. thank you so much, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
Does anyone who's here, do you have any questions for Sarah about the editing process, about different pieces of it, or maybe questions about working with an editor on a manuscript that you're currently developing, perhaps? You can post them in the chat room on the side here, or you can use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. I know one question that that somebody asked in the one of these we tried to do earlier this week before we had to reschedule. Leah was wondering about how involved an editor is or can be in the very early processes of developing a manuscript. So I think the question, because I've talked with Leah a little bit about her manuscript, so I think she's curious about going from a kind of dissertation to a book, and in the very kind of early stages of that, like what can an editor do for you? How can they help you? How can they not help you? How's that best work?
Oh, that's a great question. So there are a lot of different ways you can go about doing this. But I think one of my favorite ways to go about it is really sitting down, having the editor read through the dissertation, and having either through comments or an in-person chat, talking about what will need to change in order to make it less of a dissertation and more of a book. So perhaps you've got a really extensive literature review that shows that you've mastered the background of your topic, but now you're trying to create a scholarly manuscript where it's assumed that you or other readers already have some mastery of this. And what's really nice about being able to get rid of that is it gives you a little bit more room to put in your own creativity. You have some room to play with rather than simply proving your bona fides. We also, I think, can help you take apart what's really crucial, what the heart is, and then start thinking about narrative. In a dissertation, there's usually a very regimented format that's not always a lot of fun to read. You don't have to do that in a published book. You actually have a little more freedom to have an authorial voice and write a readable book. So we can help you think about ways to even bring a little more of your creativity into it and really show the reader why you care so much about this topic.
I'd also add, because this is helping people with their first book is something we do a lot at Ideas on Fire. And I think one of the biggest things that our clients have noticed is that when you're writing a dissertation, you're largely writing something to prove your worth. That's the function of a dissertation, is to earn a PhD. It's a document and a genre that does not exist without the end goal of getting a certificate of kind of legitimacy at the end of it, in this case, a degree. In a book, you're not proving anything. So the kind of defensiveness or over citationality that is often common and appropriate to a certain degree in a dissertation is not appropriate for a book, because people picking up a book, whether that's an academic book or whether that's a trade press book, they already think you're the expert. Your name's on the cover of a book. You are by definition an expert on that topic. So a lot of the process of translating a dissertation into a book involves heavy rewriting, particularly of sections or cutting of entire sections that are more suited to prove your worth as a scholar, that's more appropriate to a dissertation than to a book. So for instance, you'll often hear you cut the entire literature review chapter. For fields that put literature reviews in a single chapter, which is not all fields, but some kind of social science fields in particular, that chapter usually gets deleted entirely. Methodology sections or methodology chapters get dramatically reduced, sometimes even relegated to a 2-page appendix in the very back of the book when you had 50 pages on your methodology in your dissertation. So those kinds of things that are appropriate for a dissertation, that should be in a dissertation, that make a dissertation good or not, passable or not, are the very things that you delete or rewrite or rework in some way when you translate it into a book.
I don't think I've ever worked on a dissertation that didn't contain a definition of either quantitative or qualitative analysis. Complete with a couple of citations.
Which is good for a dissertation, because
Right.
you're proving to your committee that that very small group of people, those 5 people or 3 people, depending on your department, you're proving to them that you know how to be a professional in this field. That's the purpose of a dissertation. It's not the purpose of a book, because readers don't care at all. If you understand about the difference between those fields, they already know what they are. That's why they read your book.
Right. That's what they want to. They want to know what you found,
yeah,
and why it's interesting and relevant to them. So there's a little bit of a different goal there.
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely. We also have a question from an audience member. I have a question about what's the fine line between editors making changes for you and actually rewriting your work? That's a great question.
That is a great question. And this is also one that comes into play differently in different kinds of projects. So if you're working on student work, such as a dissertation, the line might be a little different than if you're working on corporate copywriting, say. For me, I think it's about whether you are, one, respecting the author's voice as an editor, and 2, whether you're sort of guiding them or forcibly turning their direction. I don't have any qualms about, say, rephrasing a sentence so that it goes from the passive voice into the active voice. If it's something grammatical, syntactical, mechanical that I'm correcting, I don't have any issue with that. If there's a factual or a content or logic question with that sentence, I'm generally not comfortable rewriting it. What I would do instead is query. So I would, make a comment saying, I'm not sure that the way you phrase this really answers the question that you're trying to answer. Have you thought about X, Y, Z? And then I would leave it to you as the writer to implement that feedback. And, and often there's a second round where I'm coming back and looking at what you've written to say, okay, that works now, let me correct this typo. But I think particularly when it's academic work, it's really, really important to keep that a very clear boundary. And also, if your academic institution has an honor code, it might even be more strict than that. I might have to write in a comment, this sentence is in the passive voice, please use active voice instead. Usually that's not an issue, but it's important to know exactly what the rules put that line at your particular institution.
I'll also emphasize that there's a big difference between editing and ghostwriting.
Yes.
Some people who are editors also provide ghostwriting services. Some do not. At Ideas on Fire, we do not. We won't write anything for you. We will fix your sentences in the way that all copy editors should know how and do, but we don't write your work for you. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Happy to talk about that if people are actually interested. But ghostwriting and editing are 2 entirely separate services, even though some individual people might offer both of those services through their business.
Absolutely.
Ghostwriting is writing for you. Your name is on it, but it is somebody else's words. Somebody else wrote that thing. It's very common in some fields. It's incredibly looked down upon in other fields. So that is very different depending on what kinds of thing you're writing. For example, a lot of biographies are ghostwritten. They're not written by the famous person whose face is on the cover of the thing. They didn't write that book. They were off being famous. As
just about any politician's book.
Any politician's book is not written by that person. Most celebrities don't. I mean, they're celebrities for other things, not for writing.
Yeah.
Right.
But on the other hand, in academia, having anyone write any of your work for you would be an enormous ethical violation.
Yes, and with huge career consequences, including potentially losing your job. So I do want to emphasize that fixing your language, putting things, the examples you're using, putting things that are in passive voice into active voice, or fixing your grammar, or making your syntax make sense, or advising that you add citations. Maybe you should cite this person's book that has been, really prominent in the field that for some reason you don't cite. Those kinds of things are editing, in contrast to ghostwriting, which is instead of me saying, I think you should add a sentence talking about this new book that just came out that everyone's talking about and how it relates to you, I'd write myself. That's the difference between ghostwriting and editing.
And that's even true, I think, for partial sentences or for partial work. So for example, I might recommend that you recast your introduction. I might offer you some guidance on how to do it or some rephrasing, but I'm not going to sit down and type out a whole paragraph.
Yeah.
That's going to be the introduction to your chapter.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions?
You can put them in the chat box, or you can use the little ask a question thing down here. Okay. Doesn't seem like we have other questions. If you if you come up with any after this, you can always contact us through Ideas on Fire. We're happy to answer any follow-up questions you have about the webinar.
Absolutely.
I'll put a link to the Prezi that Sarah was using in the chat room. You'll also, anyone who's registered for this event or for the first one that we tried to have earlier this week, you'll get a replay email in about an hour with a link to this replay video. You can watch this anytime. It stays up online forever or however long Crowdcast decides to exist as a company. It's free forever. And you'll also get a link to the Prezi. So if you wanted to take a look in more detail at anything that was on there, you could do so. So thank you so much for being with us. This is part of Ideas on Fire's webinar series. We do 1 to 2 webinars a month. You can check out the upcoming ones at ideasonfire.net/events. I think the next one we have coming up is next Tuesday, if I recall correctly. And that is focused on using your dissertation to build a non-academic career. So helping folks who are in graduate school use their dissertation to build a variety of different careers, not just a professorial one. So we also have a couple coming up about revising your dissertation into a book, other kinds of editing things, things like that. So hope you can join us for those. Ideasonfire.net/events is where you can find when those are and the topics. Thank you so much for being here and have a fabulous weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.